Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. Have you seen the Potomac River in the last couple days? It's way, way up there. A huge volume of water coming through right now with all the snow melt and so forth. And you may know that I'm on the river pretty much every day I can, unless it's iced over or really, really rainy or flooded. But I love getting out there, and it's been a while. I go out on a board, on a paddle board, but I paddle it like a kayak mostly, because I've got a lot of expensive camera and video equipment on the board. It's a nice stable platform, and I haven't flipped it in a while, which is good, because I have all that equipment just sitting on top of it. And where I paddle on the Potomac, it's quite rocky. And depending on the flow, I have to be really careful out there. I always love the story Jerry Seinfeld talks about when he tried scuba diving. And he said, I realized I didn't want to be doing a sport where I was thinking, don't die, don't die, don't die. And in part, that kind of fuels my time out on the river. It's like, don't die, don't flip. And so whenever I go upriver against the current, I have to very carefully select, what vector I'm going to take, behind rocks and islands. And in that same way, when I'm coming downriver, I have to be very careful. There are a lot of submerged rocks and there are whirlpools, and it's a very absorbing experience. I love it. In that same way, when I'm kind of on my edge, figuring out how to get up the river or down the river, it's the same thing with any task that you take on. And in particular, when you take on a spiritual practice, you want to get a sense of how things work. If you're climbing a mountain, you're going to take a look at the mountain and try to decide, how can I get up this mountain and conserve my energy? What are the dead ends I could avoid? And the same thing with spiritual practice. What's the map? Where are the potential pitfalls where you could lose energy or get lost? What are the best practices for developing wisdom and developing compassion? So I'm going to be giving a series of talks on the Eightfold Path, which are the kind of the description of the observances and restraints and the practices that help you to move toward the elimination of suffering in your life and for the increasing capacity for joy and happiness. And the Eightfold Path, these 8 principles, fall into 3 basic categories. There are the teachings that have to do with what's called sila, or your ethical behavior. And this has to do with how you use speech, skillfully or unskillfully, the actions that you take to ensure that your livelihood, how you make your living, is in alignment with the direction you want to be going in. And each one of these are ways you can lose energy or gain energy. There are specific teachings around samadhi, or how you pay attention or concentration. And these have to do with being skillful with how you apply effort, how you cultivate non-judging awareness, and how you use concentration skillfully. Like, what do you actually focus on? The third group has to do with what's called panya, or cultivating wisdom. And this has to do with keeping a broader sense of the view or the map of your practice. Remembering where you're going and where you are on that map. And being very clear about your intention as you navigate through life. So in these eightfold elements, there's not a hierarchy. It's not do this, then this, then this. But they're all each interdependent. And when you do one, they affect all the others. As one of my teachers said, it's like a garland of flowers. If you pick up one flower, the whole garland comes with them. So if you just practice, really pay attention to speech, for example, well, that includes your intention. It includes where you want to be. It draws on all the other elements, just that one practice itself. So I'd like to talk about the overview of the path tonight. And I'd like to talk about the fundamental teaching on the Four Noble Truths, which is the ultimate map that we follow. And to kind of break down a little bit more about the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And some other elements that kind of fall into the view or the perspective as we take on a practice. A lot of this will be familiar, of course. I remember when I did my first month-long retreat, where we had a Dharma talk every night. And I realized about 2 weeks in, like, hey, this is all pretty much the same talk. Maybe you've noticed that. I've listened to a lot of Dharma talks. I've given a lot of Dharma talks. Last year I counted, I gave 43 talks. And one of the most helpful suggestions as I've listened to talks, and with there being some familiarity, is to just sort of take a receptive posture. Like, some will be familiar, but sometimes you hear it in a different way. I notice quite often that when my practice deepens, I'll hear the same thing, but I'll know it from a different place inside. So here's what the Buddha said about the map. He said, what is the right view of practice? He said, it is the understanding of suffering, understanding the origin of suffering, understanding the cessation of suffering, and understanding the way that leads to the end of suffering. That's pretty succinct. And out of those 4 points has come a 2,500-year-old system that's focused on not only development but liberation, with countless practitioners and countless people who have found different degrees of freedom through focusing on these 4 different principles. And it's so interesting to see how these practices that spring from these 4 basic truths have expressed themselves all over the planet. From the very orthodox practices, those who very much want to preserve the integrity of the elemental teachings of the Buddha, to all the reformed systems of looking at how we can adapt it and make it more available to a more modern culture. You see how the practices went down into Southeast Asia and into the jungles and the forests and kept that sort of original quality. How it went along the trade routes into Tibet, took on the animistic quality, went into China, fused with the Chinese culture, made its way to Japan, the Zen quality, into Korea, made its way to the West. And as I like to say, we have sliced it and diced it and done double-blind studies and functional MRIs, and we've done our number on it. And this practice has taken the West by storm, of course. We have mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, all different applications of these teachings that come from these 4 basic principles that are at the core of freedom for you. So the first element is understanding the nature of what is called dukkha. And dukkha can be translated as stress, as unsatisfactoriness, as unsteadiness, or as suffering, as sort of the general quality. One of the things I so appreciate about the teachings through Buddhist psychology and Buddhist philosophy is the fact that this is not a feel-good path necessarily. It's not optimistic, it's not pessimistic, but it's realistic. So there it is. Suffering happens. Name it right up front. And some people, when they hear that, there's sort of like a sense of relief. Like, yeah, there it is. Let's call it out. So suffering happens. It's not that life is suffering, which is sort of a mistranslation, but it happens. It's not all the time. You'll notice that some people suffer more than others, some less than others. But the suffering, when you look closely at it, is you realize the suffering is an internal experience. Something can happen externally that can create suffering for one person, but not for another. Or you may have an experience that has created very, very deep suffering, and later there's no suffering. You may hate the fact that your intimate partner broke up with you, but you may realize later that it was for the best. And you got some really, really powerful lessons out of that experience. So, naming suffering, recognizing unsteadiness, unsatisfactoriness, is the key. One of my main teachers, Gil Fronsdal, talks about how there should be a Buddhist bumper sticker that says, "I stop for suffering." Because that's what the practice is. You see suffering. You see that dissatisfaction. And rather than turning away from it or distracting yourself or finding a way to get around it, you actually stop and you say, this is suffering. So this is also akin to identifying an illness and naming the nature of the illness. Suffering happens, and you can look closer at the nature of it. So the second of these noble truths is the understanding of the origin of suffering. The word is tanha, which one translation is thirst. And it's this thirst we have for power, for money. It can have a compulsive quality to it. Another word that is modified by this is the word craving. And it's more than just a desire. It has a power to it, that power of craving. And it doesn't really help when someone says, "Stop clinging, let go." It's not easy when you're really holding on to something tight. It's not easy when you're dealing with addiction of some kind, because that compulsion to hang on seems intractable at times. I've often shared the story of Ajahn Chah, who would wander around his meditation grounds in Southeast Asia and ask people about their practice. And he would say, "How are you doing?" And some people would say, it's tough, but I'm fine. And other people would say, "This is really, really hard. I'm really, really, really struggling." And he would say in imperfect English, "You have rope burn. Let go of the rope." And that's that clinging is. it's rope burn. And you know you want to let go, but you don't know how to let go. A good example of that drive is just looking at sexuality, of just how intense that drive is. There's a story I'd heard of an old Japanese monk who was asked by a younger monk, well, what was it like when you finally felt your sexual desires begin to fade? And he said, like getting off a bucking bronco. But when you think about your younger years, where that craving, that desire, that push is so strong. It's just part of our nature. And part of it, the clinging, is we're not just clinging to things, we're clinging to life itself. We cling to our story. We cling to our identity. We don't want to get old. We don't want to get sick. And we don't want to die. And so that's a big part of it. And learning how to shift our relationship to the fact that we will get old, we will get sick, and we will die is helpful. As my dad was moving into dementia, and before he moved into Alzheimer's, and he managed to have a pretty good sense of humor about it. Because I would say, how are you doing? He'd say, well, now I can hide my own Easter eggs. It's not that bad. And then I said, I keep meeting interesting people, new interesting people every day. So that's kind of identifying the cause of the illness, the cause of stress, unsatisfactoriness. Anything in your life where you've got a complaint, there's some form of clinging, some form of attachment, some inability to let go. Oftentimes, the first two of the Noble Truths are referred to as the bad news, and the second two are kind of the good news. The third is you can let go. There is the cessation of suffering. When you look deeply at the nature of clinging, for this insatiable thirst for being, it's a little bit easier to see the possibility of letting go. As one great teacher said, it was only when I began to accept what is here that there was the possibility of letting go. Usually we tend to meet aversion with aversion, which isn't that effective. We can't make ourselves let go, but we can look very, very closely at the nature of mind. And when you find yourself caught in some form of identification, some form where you can't let go, it can be helpful to reflect on the fact that you've let go before. You know what it's like to let go, because we've all done it. And to recognize that in the letting go, there are new possibilities. It's one of the most powerful things of practice in community. When you are associated with other people who are practicing and you can see other people who are letting go. When you see other people who feel more free. It's the most inspiring thing. That's why I moved into an ashram for lunch and stayed for 24 years. Being in that environment of constantly seeing people being sincere in their practice is just invaluable. So this is the cure. The cure is letting go. Letting go of where you're holding on. Not easy. So the fourth of these noble truths is the identification that there is a path. That there are techniques, there are practices, there are observations, there are restraints that will absolutely support you in this practice of letting go and opening to who you truly are. So when you undertake the training to be more awake, you cultivate and nurture and look closely at your ethical behavior, to really look at, is what you're doing supporting where you want to go? You evaluate your actions, whether they are taking you away or moving you toward. And you look at how you can stabilize your attention in a way that you can wake up. How do you stabilize your attention so that you can move toward that possibility of being more awake? And so this is really the treatment. So kind of in these four noble truths we have, here's the problem, here's the cause, here's the remedy, and here's the path of treatment. So the Buddha talked a lot about dukkha, talked a lot about suffering. And one of the core teachings is the fact of impermanence, that anything born out of causes and conditions is subject to change. And because they change, they're very, very unsteady. So you cannot hang on to any of these as a refuge, because it's just shifting sand. So where do you find that sense of refuge? What can you actually count on? So the path is kind of a finely tuned way that can help you to let go. Part of it is really character development. There's an element of really bringing yourself forward and challenging yourself. But ultimately, it's about letting go. And letting go can be really frightening. The strongest attachment we have is to our identity, to our story, to life itself. And it takes strength and it takes perseverance and patience to stay on a path that reveals more and more of your true nature. So a little bit about the path. If you look at the teachings about the Eightfold Path, you'll see the word right. It'll be right action, right intention. And the word right is a little problematic because it doesn't necessarily imply there's a wrong, but you can substitute other words. So I like to think of it as skillful or wise approach. So the first is right view or wise view. And this is having the right perspective. It's knowing the direction you want to go in. Knowing the end result that you are moving toward. And of course, there are many paths. You may know the story of someone who goes into a self-help section of a bookstore and says, can you help me find this book? And the person says, well, wouldn't that be self-defeating? You're in the self-help section. But if you go into a self-help section of a bookstore and you'll look at all those titles, there are so many books. There's so many people telling you the way to do it. The 7 steps to this, the 4 steps to that. So it's really helpful to pause and ask yourself why you're practicing. What is the result that you want? And so looking through this lens of our practice, we're really looking, where is the stress? And stop looking for the cause. Noticing where you're attached, noticing where you're holding on, and exploring how you can let go. Another element of the path is a wise intention. If you want to be free, there's certain attitudes that you can consciously cultivate. If you move through life with an intention to cultivate compassion, you'll affect a certain response out in the world. If you go through with aggression, it'll be a different effect in the world. If you focus on the intention to let go as opposed to chasing sensual pleasure, it's a very different experience you'll have of this life. So part of wise intention is reflecting on what do you want and how can you engage in a way that feels sincere for you. Part of the path focuses on ethical conduct, sort of an evaluation to look at how can you cultivate a sense of harmlessness, which is very, very important in this practice. There are specific teachings, if you want to settle your mind and you're killing people, stop killing people. It'll help settle your mind. If you're stealing, you might want to stop that. Notice if you're harming others with sexual energy. Notice how you're using language. All these are very helpful ways of moderating how you move through life in a way that will be more skillful and more wholesome as opposed to less wholesome. Some beautiful teachings on right speech, which we'll explore. Being very mindful of your language. We affect others and ourselves through our actions, through our speech, and through our thoughts. But speech can be incredibly healing, and it can be incredibly wounding. The Buddha spoke at length about livelihood, how you are making your way in the world, and to evaluate that it is as wholesome as possible, to find ways that you can bring your spiritual practice to your work. That can be a transformative practice. There are pieces here about cultivating the heart and mind. Cultivating a quality of inner life. There are teachings around right or wise or skillful effort. How do you bring yourself out into the world? How do you apply your life force to the world? To really look at that, to evaluate that. Inevitably, what you'll notice as you deepen your practice is you become more sensitive. There were things you did before that they're not satisfying anymore. And that's an important thing to recognize. After the Patriots lost, I deleted all my football apps. No longer tolerable. Feels so free. There are teachings we'll explore about a wise mindfulness. How do you cultivate more and more self-awareness? The highest quality of a practitioner is self-observation without judgment. How do you do that? How do you cultivate more and more non-judging presence and let that transform your life? Wise concentration. How do you focus your mind as you get more and more refined in your practice and in your life? As you practice, inevitably what begins to emerge is your mind will become more luminous. It'll become more clear, both non-judging and at the same time more concentrated. When your mind is settled and at peace, it's quiet and still and vibrantly alive. If you can imagine a pond, there are no ripples, there's no wind, and you can see all the way down to the bottom. We've all had those experiences of mind. And this is a practice of how do we cultivate that? How do we make that more and more possible in our lives? So these teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the articulation of the Eightfold Path, the practices, the technologies, the observations, they didn't just come out of the mind of the Buddha, they came out of the practice of the Buddha. They came from his direct practice. And he described it as he taught. That in his own practice, and I'll give you a really mangled translation here in my own words. But he said that in his practice, he noticed that his mind was suffering. And then he said, I directed my awareness to the attachments. So he turned his attention to, what is the attachment that is under that suffering? And I saw this is suffering. This is the cause. And this is the means of getting free. So these are the Four Noble Truths, but it's also the methodology of direct insight. You see a moment of pain or suffering, physical pain, emotional turbulence, your mind obsessing, whatever that may be. You see it. And you turn your attention toward it. You be with it. The more familiar you become with your suffering, the more that leads to wisdom. When people explore forgiveness, which is a slow process, but oftentimes the forgiveness begins when you begin to do a role reversal. That when you can really, really get what it was like for the other person, when you get that, forgiveness happens. It's not quickly, not immediately, but it begins to occur when you realize, oh, that action came out of ignorance. That action came out of fear. I see now how that person's leg was caught in a trap and how they were trying to take care of themselves. That's the beginning. So when you can turn your attention to that clench, to that suffering, you begin to see its true nature, and it begins to shift. And that's the challenge. It's like when you see a movie, you're sitting there watching this amazing story happening, and you forget that it's 24 frames per second of still images. It's nothing but still images. In that same way, when we're reacting to our lives, we're not able to slow it down. And so much of this practice is about slowing it down and bringing both attention and awareness and ultimately a sense of compassion and empathy to our experience. It's the exact opposite of what we usually do. We are biologically designed to move away from pain and move toward pleasure. And part of the Buddha's insight in his awakening was everyone's going exactly the opposite direction. They're moving away from their suffering in this chase for pleasure. When actually, when suffering arises and you can stop for it and turn to it and look closely at it, you'll begin to see very, very deeply into reality. You begin to see these three qualities of reality. First, you see impermanence. That anything born out of causes and conditions is going to change. You see dukkha. You see the suffering. That anything you try to control, anything you try to push away or hold on to is going to create more suffering. And conversely, you see that when you can let it go, the suffering ceases. But the third element you begin to see is the quality of anatta. That small self that's trying to manage everything is the cause of suffering. And when you can open and allow, your identity shifts. And you begin to identify less with the suffering, but more with the space. You begin to sense a quality of non-judging awareness, but also you begin to tap into these qualities of immeasurable kindness and capacity and for joy and capacity for compassion. So it's a little bit of these Four Noble Truths and the path. But what's most important for me is remembering that these are just words. And you only realize this through practice. You can go into a restaurant and read the menu, and you'll have a certain experience. Or you can order something and eat it, and that's where the real experience is. So your practice will reveal all of this. So on that note, why don't we close with a short meditation, just to perhaps internalize this a little bit. You might let your attention just relax and open to the here and now. And feel the aliveness of this embodied experience, this miracle of being in this body. The flow of breath, the real-time vibrations of sound, and how your body feels. There are periods of our life when we are in flow, where there is ease. And there are times when our mind becomes caught or fixated. Just recalling the elements of this practice to recognize when there is a quality of unsatisfactoriness, unsteadiness, to recognize it, to name it. And rather than to turn away, to turn toward it, to be with it, to get to know it. And to sense the possibility of letting go. In these moments, what could you let go of right now? What could soften or relax? We'll close with this sutta. Do not pursue the past. Do not lose yourself in the future. The past no longer is. The future has not yet come. looking deeply at life as it is, in the very here and now, you dwell in stability and freedom. We must be diligent today. To wait until tomorrow is too late. Death comes unexpectedly. How can we bargain with it? The wise person calls a person who knows how to dwell in mindfulness night and day, one who knows the better way to live. And sensing in these final moments this quality of mindfulness, non-judging awareness. What does that feel like right now? A mind that is free from judgment. Co-arising with non-judging mind can arise the immeasurable qualities of the heart. And you might sense in these moments your capacity for kindness, for compassion, for joy, and for a steadiness in the midst of change. And as you're ready, letting your breath deepen. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open. Well, thank you so much for your kind attention. A few quick announcements. As I like to say, the spiritual path is long and arduous, which is why cookies are so important. And I believe there'll soon be some out there in the lobby. Also, this is probably kind of the last call for the Year of Living Mindfully. If you're interested, this is a year-long program about really helping you to sustain your practice in the context of a small community. And the applications are due on the 15th, which is next week. So if you have any questions about it, I'd be happy to chat with you. I see we have some graduates here in the room as well. Thank you for your support for the class, for the church, and for myself. And if you'd like to be on the mailing list, you can sign up in the back. Thank you again.